This is He Who Moans, Doctor Who reviews. I only complain because I like Doctor Who, and I care. And I overanalyze too much because, whatever, it's just my opinion. I have no shame, well, some, about the fact that I had to have it pointed out to me that the title was a William Blake reference, and this episode was an homage to the Tiger, which, as a pretentious shit bucket, I should have got, but yeah, later I realised the reason I didn't is because whenever anyone says the words classic English poetry to me, immediately this sound goes off in my head. Sorry, that creates a continuity error, doesn't it? Hang on a sec. I realised the reason that I didn't is because whenever anyone says the words, immediately this sound goes off in my head. Oh, damn. Okay, fuck this joke. Okay, yeah, blame it on one too many lessons studying Wordsworth at school, daydreaming about how much more interesting it would be if Wordsworth and Coleridge were giant talking space velociraptors. Yeah, classic English lit and I parted company a very long time ago. Which is quite clear because I'm a grown man talking about a children's science fiction television show on the internet, and so are lots of people. Which is why the William Blake angle went pretty much unmentioned in discussions that I followed. It seems we are the circle of Philistines, and maybe that's why In the Forest of the Night seems to have had such a great critical reception, but such a poor fan reception. 'Cause, yeah, it has. But I wanted to give Frank Cottrell Boyce at least some credit here, rather than sneer, ooh, it was only made because he's a famous big-name writer. No, he did try something legit here that no one seems to be giving him credit for, myself included. Yes, he did try something here. What I did in my reappraisal following my initial reaction of yawning really loudly and playing solitaire on my phone was go and actually read Songs of Experience by William Blake, which I'd never read before and is where you actually find the tiger, which I was only vaguely familiar with one verse of referenced in pop culture occasionally, and yes, I should be familiar with it, but I'm just not, alright? I just don't like classic English poetry. It was like when I first rented The Godfather on DVD when I was a teenager. You've never seen The Godfather? Yes. People's lives are composed of lots and lots of elements, and this is one that wasn't there before. But I never pertained to being anything other than some random 20-something Doctor Who nerd with a microphone, so yeah, just the way things are really. I then went ahead and rewatched In the Forest of the Night, and you know what I found? Nothing I personally appreciate. But what I got from it was what Cottrell Boyce basically did was he was inspired to take imagery from the tiger and patchwork it into a Doctor Who plot in quotation marks. While there's nothing wrong with paying homage, you can end up with decent movies, books, TV shows out of effectively commenting on the original classic, which admittedly are always classics for a good reason. A lot of the greatest media ever made uses paying homage to create something new. In fact, pretty much all media does that in some way. It's the nature of inspiration to build on specific things that have been done before. E.g., Quentin Tarantino's entire career is completely built on homaging shitty 70s movies that no one's ever watched. One of the best episodes of Classic Who is pretty much Who Goes There by John Campbell Jr., which of course became the two Thing movies. Not a problem with that at all, it's got artistic precedent behind it. But what you've got to do to escape the wrath of cultural Philistines such as myself and about 70% of the internet, in cases like this one, is add something interesting to it. And here, In the Forest of the Night, added stuff that a certain cross-section of its audience would appreciate, and for justifiable reasons, while most people who watch my videos and chat about Doctor Who online would despise. This was why, while Into the Dalek didn't have a single original idea about it, the purpose of homaging the Fantastic Voyage was enhanced by adding brainlessly distracting shit that we found interesting. Whereas what In the Forest of the Night adds is the fairy tale fable vibe reminiscent of classic poems and a load of cultural reference points, but also some of the most cliched sick-making dialogue ever between Danny and Clara, a bunch of child actors, most of whom add literally nothing to the plot at all, of which there's barely any plot to begin with, which maybe there wasn't meant to be, but I just couldn't help but get annoyed at how something mysterious has happened, but no one really treats it like a serious problem. Which it probably would be in the real world if the Earth suddenly turned into a forest. The government seem to be the only people who give a shit about finding out what the mysterious forest is all about, and they annoyingly spend all but about 300 seconds off screen trying to solve the mystery themselves, and to be honest, no one in the foreground actually seems that bothered by it. The forest isn't a plot, it's basically just treated as a reason for people to start monologuing about how awesome trees are. Which probably sounds wonderful and poetic on paper, and yes, maybe this is me being incredibly base here going, where the shit's the plot gone, and not appreciating it for what it is, but I can't really help not really caring about anything going on screen because our characters certainly don't seem to. I just spent most of it going, fine, Mr. Cottrell Boyce, trees are great. I agree, they're pretty and lovely and colourful and wonderful. Can we get back to your actual plot now? Which is kind of understandable, since lots of the early romantic poets that he seems to have been inspired by here had a nature versus onset of industrial revolution of the time focus, so I kind of see why it ended up sounding like this. But it doesn't stop me thinking that it was boring, though. The entire thing just feels incredibly inconsequential, meandering and, well, pointless. And yes, some people have pointed out that it has a rather fucked up subtext, that the treatment of mental illness is in some way wrong, and some of the voices that you hear in your head are good ones. Yeah, I didn't get that first time round and just took it as another every child is the most special in the world narrative, which the guy's written a lot of children's books lately, and he seemed to approach Doctor Who from the perspective of kids show here. I expected that much, but the more you listen back to the dialogue here, the harder it is to avoid, and it's kind of fucked up. Before anyone says anything, though, I do reckon it was a total accident. But yeah, there definitely is legitimacy in that reading of it. Yeah, a lot of this stuff about the thoughts, it actually comes from a biography on Blake, so yeah, it was a total accident. I don't think it justifies it, but yeah, I do see where this came from. But basically, all it's done is just used imagery inspired by the tiger, but added nothing that people like me watch Doctor Who for to it, which is why we called it boring. It just feels like it was very much written with the younger end of the audience in mind, while praying to shit that everyone else watching appreciates inspiration from a piece of classic poetry enough to not realise how little there is in the way of a plot he's working with here. So it basically ended up looking like The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe, but without Christmas. That one was basically going, hey, you like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, this is like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but as a Doctor Who story. Same thing here, and in the case of a poem, it's more abstract and ambiguous, so that's why the William Blake angle's been largely ignored in ranting fan circles, because in the end it's only an homage as much as you interpret it as one, and will especially depend on whether you appreciate that. But I do want to give credit where it's due here. Cottrell Boyce does deserve credit, but that's why this one, not meant for me. I am fine with people that appreciate classic English lit, by the way. If you take anything away from this video, don't think it's that I'm a total classic lit bigot. All power to you, but I've just never shown much interest in it outside of academic study. In my downtime, I'm a pulp sci-fi guy primarily, which, yes, maybe it's a bit bigoted of me, but based on what I've seen here, call this surface reading. Feel free to refute me as usual and I'll back down, but what I see it as is the equivalent of the internal referencing that Moffat gets accused of being way too heavily reliant on. Like, look at when people were talking about the ending of Listen, tying it back to Day of the Doctor as a cool thing, but since I didn't appreciate Day of the Doctor to begin with, all I see it as is a reference to something that I don't appreciate. Yes, it does do something interesting with it. It sets it in a new context. It takes an element of something seen before and offers a new spin on it and seeks to do something new with it. Same way that people homage classic lit. But it is doing so with something that I didn't appreciate before and still don't appreciate now. And maybe this is me being the pot calling the kettle black here, because if they did the Ian Chesterton cameo, which they probably should have done by now, it would only be to pacify my fanboy brain rather than for any reason. But all In the Forest of the Night's negative reception really says is primarily that people watching Doctor Who and talking about it online don't appreciate William Blake and the folkloric fairy tale references, and there's not exactly a whole lot of crossover for those two audiences. Maybe there's something in there that I'm just not seeing with my pulp sci-fi brain. Feel free to offer me your perspective if you did happen to get what it was trying to do with it, but from my point of view, it's not really saying anything deep about its inspirational material. Whether that makes me a Philistine or not, which, okay, it definitely does, but all I know is I try and be as thoughtful as I can be when it comes to reviewing as much as possible, but I did struggle in this instance because it's just very easy to get swept up by the hate train. I didn't really appreciate anything in this episode either, which didn't help, but I wanted to give it its dues as it does deserve someone saying it has some merit, but I will say for myself and the rest of us who really disliked it, all it really comes down to in the end is the same reason that I didn't like Love and Monsters. While yes, maybe it does some things for you, and that's cool, it's clearly well made and with its own artistic intentions, and it does something for someone as intended, and all power to you if you happen to be that someone. I wish I was. Liking things feels awesome. But it doesn't do anything that I personally come to Doctor Who for based on the style of media that I appreciate, and that's all that really needs to be said about it. This specific case is one of those instances where a Doctor Who episode is clearly not meant for me. So yeah, that's why I fell asleep halfway through first watch, and why most people took steaming dumps over this one. Well done for trying, Frank. You've done something for some people, just not for me and lots of people that hated on it. But hey, live and let live, it's something for someone.